Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Kate White in New York. Kate is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 murder mysteries and multiple career books, including I Shouldn't Be Telling You This, How to Ask for the Money, Snag the Promotion, and Create the Career You Deserve, and the Gutsy Girl Handbook, Your Manifesto for Success. Kate, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Angela.
Well, I'm honored to have you. For 14 years, you were the editor-in-chief of a really great magazine we've all heard of, Cosmopolitan. And during that time, you were able to increase the circulation by 30% and take it to be the number one magazine in the U.S. And I'm curious, if you were to kind of look back at yourself earlier in your career, is there any advice that you might give yourself that was perhaps different than what the people around you were saying?
It's more that there was an absence of a piece of advice that I think is so important. And being the editor of Cosmo really drove it home for me. And that is, brand is so important. And defining your brand and sticking with it and not being tempted to go off this way or that way. Cosmo had a brand identity that was so crisp before I got there. And so my job was just to make sure I took it into the 21st century, tweak the brand enough so that it had a different sense of humor, that it was more appropriate for Gen Y and Gen X. But I was religious about holding on to the DNA. And I wish that I knew that about years and years ago when I was the editor-in-chief of other magazines, and there were a couple where I wasn't as good about probably really defining the brand early on. And I also wish I knew this more about myself in terms of my career. Like, if you can figure out what is my brand right now, and you may change it over time, but the more you try to define it, boil it down to a few words. At Cosmo, those words were fun, fearless, female. What are your 3 words? Could you put it into a brand statement that you use in your head to help you decide what's right for you?
I like that. I like thinking about sort of ourselves as a brand. And you mentioned that sometimes it changes over time, and I think that's also an important thing to keep in mind. As you've thought about maybe your own brand changing over time or other people, do you feel like there are certain things that happen that help your own personal brand to kind of evolve? Is it life events? Is it career events? I mean, what's kind of pushed your own brand?
I think it's both external and internal. The external might be your brand just kind of lost importance over time because of the marketplace. We don't need somebody doing what you do anymore, which is tough. Or you may have ended up losing your job because of downsizing, or maybe you weren't a good fit. And that might be time to say, should I be switching over here? Is there something else that I would like doing? And sometimes it's internal. I think the big wake-up for me at Cosmo, and I was lucky this happened for me, is I liked being in an environment where it was free-going, easy-going, and wacky and zany and over the top. And I had been at a couple buttoned-up magazines, like I was the editor-in-chief of Redbook for 4 years. And they clearly thought I was doing a good job because they gave me Cosmo. But I was so much happier at an unbuttoned-up place. So if you have that eureka moment where you begin to realize, you know what, I feel a little bit under a tarp here, or I don't feel I'm really singing my own song. And unfortunately, I didn't realize on my own, I just lucked out, but it makes me realize the more you can kind of step back on a regular basis and evaluate, hey, is this a good fit for you? Are you happy? Do you go to work excited every day or almost every day?
I think those are all really good points. And, you mentioned something about sometimes it's an external factor, like, for example, maybe your job is no longer needed. And I know Here in Memphis, for example, I worked with a group of writers from our local paper who were laid off because the paper changed its structure. And I'm curious, if we're listening today and we're a job seeker and maybe we have a real love of print or newspapers or magazines, like anything that's in print. I mean, what advice would you have for us about our future careers, given sort of like the evolution that's happening within the media business that's kind of around sort of the internet and the digital space?
Oh, Angela, it pains me to say it, but I think I would say don't do it because I really see print under such assault. And I know I have fabulous people I worked with at Hearst who are still there on the executive side. And I think most people would say there will still be print products, maybe decorating magazines, magazines that we just want to be able, for whatever reason, to see big glossy pictures of. But I look at my own daughter and so many of the young women I mentor who are in their 20s, they don't read print, and it's not important to them. They didn't grow up with it. And so don't be stupid. It's not going to be a huge viable thing with lots of opportunities the way it was just fortunately for me when I went into it. I saw a stat the other day from a person in the business, and again, I don't have inside info on this magazine, but I heard it from a couple people that the latest issue of Glamour magazine on newsstands around the United States sold like 25,000 copies in the United States. Mm-hmm. And when I was at Cosmo, we were selling at the peak over 2 million copies a month.
Oh my gosh.
So let that be a comparison. Not that, Glamour was our nearest competitor, and they sold about 1 million under us, but they were selling 1.3 million at one point in time when I was there. So that was just a short while ago. So there is a loss of demand, and then as I see companies struggling to fix it, they're making really bad choices, I think, in the product they put out there. They're bringing in digital people to fix print, and digital people don't know anything about print, from what I could see. And so I think you have to understand it's changing, that it's much better to think of yourself as I'm going to create content, I'm going to love creating content, there will be an insatiable demand for it, but that print takes some time to figure itself out, and there probably won't be a lot standing in the end.
It's so sad.
I know, but it's partly why I got out, because I felt, as much as I love my job, part of it was wanting to make a change while I still could and live a more entrepreneurial lifestyle, but I also could see the handwriting on the wall in a way I think sometimes when you're young you don't, because it's not like management is booming this information to you.
That's true. That's very true. And I've even noticed with sort of online publications that sometimes they're turning to people who will write pieces for free or for kind of on the side, as opposed to having as many maybe people on staff. So it even seems like in the online space for websites that put out a lot of content, I don't know how many new jobs are truly being created there.
Well, I know that was certainly the model originally. Hey, we'll let you promote yourself, promote your brand, promote your book, promote whatever you're working on, but you write the piece for free. But I know a bunch of people now who are writing for websites and they're getting paid for it.
Oh, that's good.
Not necessarily what you were paid in the magazine day. I think when I left Cosmo, we were at over $2 a word for a piece, and I don't think it's anything close to that. And unfortunately, the perks aren't there. When I was in the magazine business, there were just so many fun, fabulous perks that came with the job. At the high end, you did get things like clothing allowances and town cars taking you around. But even for assistants, they got to go to movie screenings and beauty giveaways. And unfortunately, that stuff isn't happening the way it used to be. But something else will come along. Change is part of life, and It's just right now, if it's what you want, we haven't seen how it's all going to shake down.
I think that's really great advice. Well, you wrote a book that I mentioned in the opening called "I Shouldn't Be Telling You This," and you actually have a chapter in that book called "Ballsy Strategies for Finding a Job." And as we're thinking about finding a job, and maybe it's something in a new industry, I'm curious, what's maybe one of the more ballsy strategies that you have used when it came to finding a job?
One of the ballsy strategies I ever used, and it doesn't sound that ballsy when I tell you, but for me it was. And I mention it in the book that you just mentioned, and also in the Gutsy Girl Handbook, and that is to ask for the business. I was up for a job as editor-in-chief of a parenting magazine, and I really wanted it because I had a nice job at this fashion magazine, but my boss was making my life miserable. I had a new baby, and she wanted me to work kind of crazy hours unnecessarily. So I quickly said, I got to get out. I got to find something else, and because my kid was my priority, and.
Right.
So I thought, hey, this wonderful job opened up as editor-in-chief of a parenting magazine, and I thought, they're not going to want a bad mommy on this job. So I'm sure if I get the job, I can create my own hours and leave whenever I want. So I wanted the job so badly. And at the end, I think of maybe the second interview where I met with the publisher and the president of the company after the first interview with the headhunter. They said at the end, any other questions? And I said, no, not a question, but, and I went in and I explained how much I wanted the job, what a great job I thought I could do, and how I would make them really proud. And it was almost like I was speaking in Pentecostal tongues. I just came out, and I often thought it was because I was so fiercely didn't want to be working with a boss who didn't appreciate that I was a new mom. And later, after I got that job, and I loved that job, the publisher said to me, we love the fact that you asked for the business, which is a sales expression. So I always advise people at the end of the interview, let them know you want it. Be authentic sounding, but let them know you want it, and not just for your own sake, but because what you can do for them.
That's such good advice. It's interesting how much that very end of the interview matters. I've worked with a lot of job seekers who, when they're asked that question, do you have any questions at the very end? I think they're trying to be polite, and they'll say, no, thank you. I've learned everything I need to know. And then occasionally I will know the hiring manager just by chance, and they'll call me and say, gosh, that person, we're not going to hire them because they weren't really interested. They didn't have any questions at the end. And
that's so interesting you say that, because I saw a study that showed that the biggest problem interviewers have is lack of enthusiasm on the part of the candidate. And I just think people make the mistake of wanting to seem cool and confident, and I'm not sweating this. But a headhunter once told me, Kate, you got the Red Book job because you just seemed, basically like a hot tamale. Like, I didn't hide my heart on my sleeve. I put it out there. Or I wore my heart on my sleeve. I didn't hide it under my sleeve. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with showing your passion and walking in and right away saying, oh, this looks like such a great workspace. And then, as you say, you've got to have good questions, not things like, what's the vacation policy?
Right.
And then when those questions are done and they say, is there anything else, that's when you can say something like, yes, wow, I knew I was interested in the job coming in, but everything you have said makes it sound absolutely terrific. Here's what I think I could bring by coming here. Mm-hmm. And I used to love that when I was at Cosmo, the women who came in looking really lit up about the experience.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think, too, you mentioned that you were in a situation where you really needed to make that change. I think sometimes when we have that added pressure, we might push ourselves to do something out of our comfort zone, like make that pitch at the end,
Right. And it felt awkward. And I actually said to my husband later, boy, I think I just did too much gobbledygook there at the end with this thing. But later when she said, "We love that you asked for the business."
Yeah, I mean,
I thought it worked. It was clear it had a good effect.
Well, I don't think anyone's ever not been hired because they were too excited. I mean,
yeah. As a saleswoman I know says, when it's a draw, the one who wants it most wins.
Right. Well, I'm curious, not to go on a quick, tangent, but you mentioned that in this case, you worked with a headhunter to, it sounds like, land this interview. And I very often get questions from job seekers about whether or not they should work with headhunters and the opinion on headhunters. Do you have a position on that?
Well, I've only worked with them when they were hired by the company. Mm-hmm. So I've never gone to one directly. They've only reached out to me because, let's say, the Hearst Corporation hired them to find the editor of Redbook.
Oh, I see. Well, I think the maybe the lesson there is that a headhunter is hired by the company.
Right.
So
exactly.
as much as they are helpful to job seekers, but anyway,
you want to know where their loyalties are.
Yes. Well, in your book, you also write about how to nail a job interview, and I was thinking you've run 5 magazines, you've interviewed hundreds of people over the years. I'm curious, when it comes to nailing an interview, what could we do to nail that job interview?
Well, I think one of them is just what I touched on before. Be enthusiastic. Really show them the love. And make it about them, too. I sometimes say, and Angela, maybe you don't say it the same way to job seekers you work with, but I sometimes say they don't give a rat's ass about where you want to be in your career necessarily. Mm-hmm. They want to know what you can do for them. So keep that in mind. Keep finding ways to bring it back to what you could bring and what experience you could offer. I mean, this is a risk, but sometimes I've even had people make little suggestions as we're talking about something, maybe with a section in the magazine. They might say, would you have ever thought of having so-and-so do this? It's risky, but you see that they spend some time thinking about it. And part of showing the love is being really prepared. This young girl I was mentoring at one point because her aunt is a good friend of mine, a young woman, I should say. She had gone on a job interview with Anna Wintour at Vogue to be her assistant. And Anna Wintour asked her about a couple of pieces that had been recently, and she hadn't read them. She hadn't looked at the magazine. And so that interview ended very early. And so she didn't show the love by being prepared. And I think just sort of one more thing that's part of that overall is to own the first 5 to 10 minutes. As I know, you probably know from research, the decision not to hire is often made within the first 5 to 15 minutes. And we did a big study when I was at Cosmo of human resource managers on this, and they confirmed that for us, 500 of them, yes. It's not they decided to hire you, but they've decided initially, you know what, this person isn't going to work. I'm going to go through the rest of the interview, but they're not going to be a good fit here. So it's very important those first 5 minutes to know you are being judged. They're not letting you relax, will your sweat glands into a quiet position. They're judging you. So you want to make sure your body language is positive, that you look like you're not holding your jugular or wringing your hands or doing too much of those self-pacifiers. I once had a woman almost restyle her hairdo. She sat in my office. She was twirling her hair so much, I thought she's going to leave with a different style. So I loved her. And that didn't hold anything in the end against her. She's somebody I still mentor and love. And you want to have a good eye contact. You want to give a good handshake. You want, of course, to look great in the interview. And that, I think, is is so important. And we sort of think we have a little time to warm up, but we don't if they're judging us quickly.
I totally agree. I think the research I've seen says you get about 4 minutes. And, so often it's like we're so stressed about the entire interview and answering every question perfectly. But that first 4 minutes is very often very superficial. It is, like you said, how did you shake hands? Did you make eye contact? How did you answer the question, tell me about yourself? And those are things you can prepare in advance.
Absolutely. And, you can find on the internet typical questions that people ask in interviews. And you might be inclined to think, well, no, they're not going to use questions other people have asked, but they do, because people use questions they've been asked, and they sometimes use stupid questions, but it's good to be prepared for them.
I mean, the hiring manager themselves is often not like an expert interviewer, and they may even be nervous too. So to me, pulling questions from the internet is super normal. I mean, it's the quickest way to get the job done.
Right. Particularly if you're young, you might go and Google, what are the questions I should ask?
Right.
One other just really little thing, but I love this. And I think I mentioned this in the book, too. There was a great guy who worked for me, and he later went on to oversee all of the talent acquiring at Hearst. So he worked in HR there. But he only did the very high-end editor-in-chief, fashion directors, photo directors, very senior editorial people. And he was so good at it. And he said that one of the things that the real go-getters always did that translated as passion and enthusiasm is they sat on the edge of their seats. And I would almost think we might think, oh, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to look like I'm too goofy. But my feeling is people like passion and enthusiasm, even if sometimes it might read a little homespun. And I know it worked for me to not feel I had to tamp that down, to just be me, as crazy as it might have seemed at times. Now, if I were going for a law firm, I might not be exactly Kate White, because that might terrify a white glove firm. But for so many fields, they're looking for your enthusiasm and what you're going to bring there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's not only that enthusiasm, like in your voice and the message, but like you said, it's sitting on the edge of the chair. It's paying attention to that body language, because really, I think very often the hiring managers take as much away from your body language as they do from your actual message that comes out of your mouth.
Oh, they do. And without even knowing it. I was so fascinated with body language early in my career that I ended up pitching a couple of article ideas on it and wrote pieces on body language and interviewed a lot of wonderful experts. And when you read about it and understand things we do, it is fascinating. For instance, it's okay for a boss to look away when you are, or a high level person, to look away when you're talking to him or her, but you're not supposed to do that when you are listening to that person if you're subservient.
Right.
So it's good to know sort of the rules. You want to maintain eye contact and not look away as if you're preoccupied when they're speaking. But Janine Driver always says, you don't want to bore into their eyes. So she's a body language person who says, look at their forehead, then look at their cheek, look at their chin, look at their nose. Let your eyes move around a little bit. So you're not boring in like children of the corn.
Right? That's very good advice. Well, I want to touch on another topic that's very related to this topic, which is appearance. And I will be honest, I, as a coach, have a very hard time tackling this issue when I talk to job seekers, because it's so hard to look at someone and say, you really need to get your hairstyle under control, or your outfit is just not working for this job interview, or whatever. It's hard to give that feedback, but I feel like you would be the perfect person to give us some feedback on this because of your background. So what should we know about our appearance as it comes to job seeking?
Oh, that it matters. And Angela, I'm glad you got to this topic because it is an awkward one. And we do feel, why isn't it just about me? But people judge us quickly. They judge us on appearance. And it's really important to be aware of that. And instead of getting all grumpy and thinking it's not fair, think of it as one more thing that we can use to our advantage, another card we can play. And I always tell people this is one rule that I don't believe has ever changed. You need to dress for the job you aspire to.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you want to basically be sure that you look appropriate for that job. And in an interview, err on the side of even a little better than that, but not looking like you're inappropriate. The IT person at Hearst used to say to me, look, people show up in IT wearing as, dressed down as possible clothes, but I like to see them a little bit more buttoned up for the interview.
Sure.
And so you want to do some due diligence. You can ask friends who've worked at the company, tell me what people wear. You can look at the website, the annual report where you see pictures of people, and then you could ask someone you know who works there, someone through LinkedIn that you've connected with, okay, but how about for the interview? Do I take it up a notch for that? To be honest, my daughter's in the film business, and I drilled this home to her, and she went on an interview where listening to my advice, she dressed a little too up for a film set.
Mm.
And she got the job, but the woman said, those aren't the kind of clothes you would wear when you show up for work because it's going to be more rugged. And I probably should have advised her to not dress that far up. So do your research. Don't let your mommy tell you what to do. In the case of my daughter. But definitely. And then once you start working, you want to keep dressing for the job you aspire to, and you cannot let your peers talk you out of it, because sometimes when you're looking great and you're investing in a certain look, they're going to nudge you about it. In fact, a young woman wrote me and said that when she started dressing for the job she aspired to, one of her coworkers said, "You're reckoning for all of us."
Oh.
Ignore them. Just look the part, because your boss wants to envision you for that promotion one day, and if he or she can't, it's going to work against you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. I think you're right too about doing the research. I mean, I had personally an experience where, my background is in engineering originally, so we were trained to wear a black suit, and be very, very formal. And I remember years ago flying out to Santa Barbara, interviewing at a fashion company, like a kind of high-end natural fabric sort of women's clothing.
I see where this is going.
Right? And I was very qualified and very excited about the job. And I could see the moment that they looked at me, in their Birkenstocks and their super natural fiber, outfit, they just couldn't see me there. And, it never had crossed my mind, because I had always been told you wear a black suit and you dress very formal and you pull your hair back. And so, and I would say in the reverse, I have a colleague that I went to graduate school with in Los Angeles who is a digital marketer, and he flew out to, I think it was Boston or somewhere on the East Coast, for a job interview that he was totally qualified to do. And he walked in with jeans and a blazer, and they looked at him like, he landed from another planet,
Right.
because they were expecting a suit and he was in jeans. So I think it's, different industries, just different things are appropriate.
Yeah. And, Angela, it isn't just, oh, he doesn't look like he works here, or she doesn't look like she works here, and that's weird. It also says to them, you didn't bother doing any research.
Right.
And today it's so easy. You could look at people who work in the company, their LinkedIn profiles, and see their outfits. You can get a sense of it from so many ways. And it's important to do that. And one of the things, too, is to understand that you want to aim when you're young, too, for as much quality as you can in your clothes. which is tricky when you're on a budget. But a stylist I worked with for years at Cosmo used to say, buy neutral colored classic pieces, black and camel and navy, and good shoes. They can be knockoffs of designer shoes, and a nice handbag if you're a woman, and the same colors for guys. And then you could add from cheaper places some a shirt that's very trendy or something. So you want those quality pieces because they translate as quality in a job interview and in the first years you're working.
I totally agree. I definitely agree. Well, as I speak with job seekers, usually everybody has like one thing that they're really worried about, and it could be they feel like they look too young or that they don't look the right size, or there's always one thing that's like the thing that's on their mind. And I'll tell you, the number one sort of thing that people worry about is typically that they feel too old. And I'm curious, when you hear that kind of feedback and someone says, I feel like I'm going into interviews and I'm not getting the job because I'm perceived to be too old based on how I look, is there anything that we can do to maybe come across as younger, or so that maybe we minimize that issue?
Get rid of the pantyhose. I do think this is about research, too.
Okay.
That one thing that I always tell people, particularly in their 40s and 50s, because you are becoming more vulnerable in that period. It's a great time in your career to build expertise and great titles and build your income. But at the same time, you've hit a vulnerable period again, because companies, as they downsize, as they go through transition, are trying to figure out if they can replace you with somebody who's younger and will make less money but do what you do. So it's important to bring everything to the table in terms of your ideas and performance, but also to your appearance. And I recommend that you have not only older mentors, but that phrase we hear sometimes, reverse mentors. People who are younger, maybe they're friends of your kids, that you could just say, hey, what would you think if I got rid of the pantyhose? And if you're in your company or the company you're applying to, women do not wear nude pantyhose in the summertime. You're going to look weird if you're doing it. You're going to date yourself. And if they don't wear navy blazers anymore, you don't want to be the last woman standing in a navy blazer. And so do the research. And then in terms of, do you color the gray? I think you have to make that decision yourself. I know I would, because I edited a magazine for women in their 20s and 30s, and I would never for a second have had gray hair doing it. It might have been fine if I did, but I thought, look, I'm not in the age group of the reader, but I don't want to go overboard to reinforce that idea. I've been dyeing my hair blonde since I was 13. I have no idea if I have gray. I have not seen the natural color of it for so many decades. But I think for me, I don't see it as a negative to make sure that my makeup and my hair and those things seem modern, I guess is one way to put it. I'm not caught up with being youthful, but in the business I'm in, it has mattered, and I think you make that choice yourself. But you don't pretend it might not be a factor.
I think you're right. I mean, it goes back to the whole sort of like unconscious bias. Like, people are judging you whether they think about it or not. And
right. That's right. And we are in a very ageist, I see it all the time, even with myself now, that I've left Cosmo and I'm in my 60s. You realize little things people do. That had to do with being a certain age.
Absolutely. Well, so, Kind of transitioning to like a different topic, I saw a video that you did, and I'm not sure what the event was that you were speaking at, but you gave a story about negotiation, and you talked about one of your experiences with negotiation that I thought was really special, where you talked about getting the help of an outsider to kind of help you to be able to negotiate your salary. And I'm curious, because you've been through a lot of different jobs and negotiations, like what are some takeaways that you might share with us if we're interviewing and potentially negotiating?
Oh, maybe you're talking about Bob.
I am.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer that they're almost always lowballing you. So you do have to negotiate. And I think women in particular today have heard this. You've got to negotiate your starting salary. You've got to ask. But studies still show that both men and women often fail to negotiate a starting salary. Women more so than men, according to studies, but both don't do it. And it's scary because you don't want them to whisk the job away, the offer away by saying, oh, you shouldn't have pushed. That's not nice of you. So you get a little nervous, but I think it's important to know that there's often, as one wonderful expert I interviewed from George Mason College said to me, there often is money on the table and you're walking away from it if you don't negotiate. And you can negotiate in a way that isn't pompous or seem too irritating to the other person. It's just a matter of saying, oh, wow, I'd love to come work here. That I'm so honored to be offered the job, but I was hoping for X amount, which is different than the amount they offered. The story about Bob is that I learned the value of asking, but it still made me nervous. And when I was up for a big job as the editor-in-chief of a women's service magazine, they offered me the job telling me the basic package, but they wanted to hammer out some of the details. And I still can't believe I did this. I asked my accountant, Bob, to come with me to the meeting. My husband was a TV anchorman, and so I saw all his life he's had agents helping him negotiate. And I thought, I'm going to have Bob kind of be my agent. But I told the two guys, Bob was my accountant, and he was just going to help me. Well, poor Bob, he'd never done anything like this before, and he was dropping his papers and just looking kind of like, wow, he had too many papers. But he asked some good questions, and the guys got up to leave, and they said, we'll be back in a few minutes after you guys have a chance to look everything over. They come back in a few minutes, and they say, have you had a chance to look everything over? And Bob says, yes, we have, and now we're ready to negotiate. And he negotiated much more than they had offered. And I told this story years later to some women at Cosmo as a pep talk about the importance of asking. And one of them said, God, we need a Bob. And I said, well, that was kind of a fluke situation, so it's BYOB, be your own Bob. And you just have to do it even though it sounds scary. In fact, someone just told me the other day, who I adore, she got this great new job with a great new salary. And she's a young woman and is a sort of a professional colleague of mine. And I said, oh, my gosh, tell me. And she goes, well, I used the identical script that you give in Gutsy Girl Handbook, and I just did it, and they met my offer. So it's worth it, I think, Angela. They're not going to yank it away if you throw out another number and talk about it in terms of not what you deserve, but what you feel is appropriate for your skill level.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think you're 100% right. And definitely the folks I speak with, their fear is, like you said, that it'll be kind of taken back.
Yeah.
And I've never seen that happen, but I'd have to think if a company did that after you were reasonable and respectful in your request, that maybe that wouldn't be a place you would want to work.
Oh, right. I mean, they would be crazy people, and you would find out the other ways they're crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, and, very often I also talk to folks who say, well, I think I could just get my foot in the door and then I can ask for a raise later. But I think in reality, once you started a company, at least, it seems like most companies today are giving these, whether it's 2 to 3% a year raises, but rarely are you getting like a huge
I
jump.
know. And I made that mistake once. I took a job without negotiating, telling myself, well, I'll get one when I'm there. And the job paid $50,000. And even though my boss loved me, and back then he gave me a couple 16% raises, but on $20,000, even 16% doesn't go very far. So you have to realize that it can make such a huge difference. In fact, there's this very interesting stat. The woman who I interviewed from George Mason said that if you were offered 50 and negotiated up to 55,000 over the course of your professional lifetime, factoring in normal good raises, it would add up to over $650,000.
Right.
So you are losing your platform. You're chopping down your platform that you're supposed to build on when you don't negotiate.
100%. And I think also, if you take that low salary and then you go back and you're asking for like, let's say a 50% raise, because that's what would be reasonable, like once you've started, I mean, it comes across, I think, as almost kind of rude, because it's like, we hired you for this much to do this job. You're doing this job, and now you want this much more to do the same job. Like,
yeah, you sound like a whiner. And of course, the person's thinking, "Why am I having this discussion now?"
Right.
And we didn't have it 6 months ago.
Right. What's the problem? What are you doing that's so special? Like you're doing what I paid you to do. So
yeah, and well, we told you to be doing.
Right. Well, so I guess along the lines of sort of this internal conversation that we might be having with our boss or with our company, I often also talk to job seekers who are having a really hard time getting promoted internally. And you actually recently wrote a blog post about this called The Surprising Reason You're Not Getting Promoted. And I'm curious if we're getting passed over, but we're not getting selected, is there anything else we should consider, like if we're otherwise a good employee?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, what I always recommend is you find out the reason you didn't get promoted. Because if you're just going to leave with your tail between your legs and tell yourself, I'm going to come back in 6 months, you don't have info. So the most important thing is to find out what was and I worked with a person who was so great when we didn't get a sale. Rather than put the person in the corner, like, why didn't you buy advertising pages with us? She would say, tell us what we have to do next time to win your account. And so what you need to say to your boss without boxing him into the corner is, Bob, I really want promotion to do next. So I can definitely secure it that I'm ready in your eyes. And then you've got information that you can work with, and it could be you're not up to the level of experience that he or she wants. It could be bias, and you can see that in the kinds of things they're saying. It could be that they're not aware of everything you're doing. One of my favorite stories, there was a woman who was ad director, I think, when I read book, and the associate publisher left, and she wanted to be the associate publisher. And the publisher wanted her to have the job, but the president of the magazine division met with her and said, look, I love you, but I think the job is too much for you. She went home that night, wrote a paper called 10 Reasons the Job Really Isn't a Stretch. And that week she got the job. So sometimes it may be an opportunity to clarify with the person, but you're not going to be able to do anything if you don't have the information. The other thing to keep in mind, which goes back to the blog I wrote, I saw an interesting study that said that men are 20% more likely than women and people of color to be given the kind of glamour assignments that are going to get you promoted, like representing the company at a conference or running a new team. And if you're not getting those, you need to raise your hand for them. You always need to be doing more than what you're told to do. You want to not just please your boss, you want to dazzle your boss. And lastly, it's important to know that in a lot of companies, they don't promote you just because you've been there 2 years and you're doing a great job. There's got to be an opening.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You have a head count as a boss, and just because somebody's ready doesn't mean that you've got a spot to put her in or him in. But then that helps to have the conversation because now you know, and maybe instead you say, okay, I can understand that. What about a title change?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I mean, I think it's about timing, and it's certainly not all about us as a job seeker, and what we want. I mean, the company is ultimately the customer, and it depends a lot on what they need at that moment.
Angela, that's another point. So often I would find people would push for promotions about why they needed it or deserved it. Or one time somebody even told me her husband took a pay cut so he could work at another restaurant as a chef. And that's not my problem, unfortunately, as a boss. And so you have to make it about them. And here's a little trick that I love. Instead of just talking about everything you've done, talk about what you might do. Whet my appetite. Let's say you're an associate editor at Cosmo. It was 6 years ago, so it was a while ago. But let's say you want this senior editor position that's opened up and you make the pitch. Don't just tell me about all the things you've done. Tell me something like, I know that Esther was working on the such and such column, the gyno column, and though I think it's really strong, I've been thinking about how wouldn't it be great if we did this? Let me know what you're gonna have to offer, what you've got up your sleeve that might make me see that not only do you have great experience in the past, but you've got great ideas for the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I totally agree. And I think it takes it from a place of coming across as entitled to something to, truly adding value. And that's a really different position.
One thing I say to my millennial children who I adore, don't look entitled. Don't see, because I would sometimes see a real issue with the millennials who came in to apply for jobs. They didn't know how to turn that little humble switch on momentarily and just let me know what they were going to do for me. A lot of it became what I was going to could do for them.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. Well, Kate, you've given us so much good information today. I'm so excited that you've been here. I'd love to learn where we can get a copy of your new book, The Gutsy Girl Handbook, your Manifesto for Success.
Oh, thank you, Angela. And as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff, so thanks so much for the opportunity. And I know it's clear we both deal with a lot of the same issues as we work with people. The book, The Gutsy Girl Handbook, your Manifesto for Success, which I was thrilled to see went to #1 on Amazon in the Women in Business category.
That's exciting.
You can find it any place. You can find it at Barnes & Noble. You can find it online with Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And if you want to find out more about me, my speaking, you can go to katewhitespeaks.com. I also am a New York Times bestselling author of murder mysteries and thrillers, 13 of them, and you can find out about those just at katewhite.com. So that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Kate. I will add links to all of these in the show notes so that we can find your book and check out more about you. And thank you so much for being here today. This has been great.
Thanks so much, Angela.
Thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes. The more subscribers that we have, the easier it is for other people to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.